The Blackwater Slough on the outskirts of Oakhaven, Florida, was a place where things went to rot. On a suffocatingly humid morning in September 1962, local alligator trapper Bo Miller was navigating his flat-bottomed skiff through the dense, tannin-stained water, using a long cypress pole to push past heavy curtains of Spanish moss. The air smelled of sulfur, decaying vegetation, and wet, ancient mud. Bo was looking for the glowing amber eyes of a bull gator in the reeds, but instead, his wooden pole struck something hard just beneath the surface of the green duckweed. It sounded hollow, like striking the hull of an overturned boat. Curious, Bo rolled up his canvas sleeve and plunged his thick, sun-baked arm into the murky water. His fingers brushed against something impossibly smooth-curved and eerily anatomical. With a heavy grunt, he hauled the heavy object over the side of the skiff. It landed on the wooden floorboards with a dull, heavy thud, scattering a puddle of dark swamp water over his boots. Bo fell backward, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. It was a woman, or rather, the perfect, terrifying ghost of one. Lying in the bottom of his boat was a life-size, translucent shell made of hardened, milky white fiberglass and industrial resin. It was a flawless, three-dimensional negative of a human female. The contours of her face, the gentle curve of her collarbones, the agonizing, frozen stretch of her open mouth. Every single detail was captured with surgical, terrifying precision. But there was no flesh, no bone, no blood inside. It was entirely hollow. Then, the morning sun broke through the thick cypress canopy, catching a bright metallic glint embedded deep within the hardened plastic of the shell's chest. It was a solid gold locket, permanently fused into the artificial skin. Tangled within the hardened resin around the locket were a few strands of real, human auburn hair. Bo didn't know it yet, but he had just dredged up the gruesome masterpiece of the most unusual serial killers the state of Florida had ever seen. Exactly 3 months earlier, mid-June 1962, Oakhaven was a sleepy, sun-baked town built entirely on citrus money and generational vanity. It was a place where wealthy widows lived in sprawling antebellum estates, drinking gin fizzes on their wraparound porches, while their youth slowly evaporated in the punishing southern heat. They had money, they had time, and they had a desperate, clawing fear of growing old. They were the perfect prey. The trap arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It didn't look like a predator. It looked like the future. A gleaming, cherry-red 1958 Cadillac Eldorado rolled slowly down Main Street, pulling a massive 30-foot Airstream trailer. The aluminum exterior of the trailer had been polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the dusty storefronts and the sprawling orange groves like a silver bullet passing through a dream. Painted in elegant, cursive black lettering on the side of the trailer was a single word, Elysium. Below it, in smaller print, advanced aesthetics and cellular rejuvenation. The Cadillac parked at the edge of the affluent historical district, right where the manicured lawns bled into the dense, wild foliage of the swamp's perimeter. The driver's door opened, and Thalassa Vane stepped out into the crushing Florida heat. She was a vision of calculated, predatory elegance. An American woman of Greek descent, Thalassa possessed sharp, striking Mediterranean features. High, aristocratic cheekbones, olive skin, and eyes as dark and hard as polished obsidian. While the local women wore floral sundresses and sweated through their powder, Thalassa wore an impeccably tailored, charcoal gray Chanel suit, looking entirely unbothered by the suffocating humidity. For 5 years, Thalassa had worked as a right-hand surgical assistant to one of Miami's top plastic surgeons. She knew the anatomy of the human face intimately. More importantly, she knew the anatomy of female insecurity. She knew exactly what women would pay and what they would endure to erase a single wrinkle. The heavy metal door of the Airstream creaked open, and the second half of the deadly equation emerged into the sunlight. Ines Calderon did not share Thalassa's glamorous facade. She was a Cuban immigrant who had fled Havana 3 years prior, bringing with her a brilliant, terrifyingly analytical mind. Ines was small, severe, and painfully quiet. She wore a pristine white clinical coat over a drab brown dress, her dark hair pulled back into a tight, punishing bun. Her hands were perpetually encased in thick, white latex surgical gloves. She smelled faintly of lavender, but underneath the pleasant floral notes was a sharp, undeniable chemical sting of industrial solvents and acetone. Ines was a chemist, a genius of compounds, catalysts, and molecular bonds. Before she met Thalassa, Ines had been working on experimental, quick-curing polymers for a nautical manufacturing plant in Tampa. Thalassa, recognizing the dark potential in the quiet, bitter scientist, had recruited her for a much more lucrative and infinitely more sinister enterprise. Together, they were a perfect lethal machine. Thalassa was the bait, Ines was a trap. Within 48 hours of their arrival, Thalassa had already infiltrated the Oakhaven Country Club. She sat by the swimming pool, sipping an iced tea, her dark eyes scanning the wealthy wives like a hawk surveying a field of mice. She spoke with a smooth, hypnotic cadence, dropping deliberate hints about a revolutionary, highly exclusive European treatment that Elysium offered. It wasn't just a facial cream or a massage. It was a Chrysalis, a full-body chemical thermal wrap that purged toxins, shed dead skin, and literally hardened the body's tissues into a state of youthful perfection. It is a cocoon of eternal youth, Thalassa whispered to a tight circle of mesmerized, aging women, her voice dripping with honey and venom. You step in exactly as you are, and you emerge flawless, untouched by time. She didn't tell them that they wouldn't emerge at all. She didn't tell them about the gallons of industrial epoxy resin, the heavy rolls of suffocating fiberglass tape, or the vats of caustic sodium hydroxide hidden inside the gleaming silver Airstream. The trap was set. Now, they just needed their first butterfly to walk willingly into the web. Eleanor Vance was a woman sculpted by loneliness and gin. At 62, the widow of Oakhaven's wealthiest citrus baron, resided in a sprawling 14-room Victorian estate that felt more like a grand mausoleum than a home. Her husband had left her millions in trusts and land deeds, but he had also left her with a crushing, suffocating silence and a vanity that bordered on severe neurosis. Eleanor spent hours in front of her antique silver vanity mirror, stretching the loose, crepey skin of her jawline with trembling, manicured fingers, desperate to catch a glimpse of the vibrant, magnetic girl she had been 30 years ago. When Thalassa Vane whispered the promise of the Chrysalis at the country club luncheon, Eleanor didn't hear a carefully rehearsed sales pitch. She heard absolute salvation. On a stifling Thursday evening, just as the cicadas began their deafening, rhythmic hum in the Spanish moss, Eleanor arrived at the gleaming silver Airstream. She carried a custom-made crocodile leather purse and wore a heavy, ornate gold locket around her neck, a piece she vehemently refused to take off, claiming it was her only tangible connection to her late husband. Thalassa opened the heavy metal door, greeting her with a smile that was impossibly warm, expertly calculated, and perfectly hollow. Eleanor, my dear, welcome to Elysium. Are you ready to leave the past behind? The interior of the trailer was a jarring, surreal contrast of wild, overgrown Florida swamp outside. It was a masterpiece of mid-century modern clinical luxury. The curved walls were lined with polished chrome, frosted glass, and white leather upholstery. Soft, hypnotic jazz, the slow, melancholy trumpet of Miles Davis, drifted from a high-fidelity phonograph in the corner. The air was thick with the scent of crushed lavender, though it barely concealed a sharp, underlying chemical tang that stung the back of Eleanor's throat and watered her eyes. In the rear of the trailer, standing beneath a bright, circular surgical halo light, was Ines Calderon. The silent Cuban chemist wore her heavy white clinical coat, a thick rubber apron, and elbow-length latex gloves. She didn't offer a polite greeting. She was already at her stainless steel workstation, aggressively stirring a thick, viscous gray slurry in a heavy industrial bucket. Lie back, Eleanor. Let the world drift away. Thalassa cooed in her velvet voice, guiding the wealthy widow to a heavily reinforced, reclining cosmetological chair anchored securely to the floorboards in the center of the room. Eleanor stripped down to a thin, disposable silk robe. She lay back on a leather chair, her heart fluttering with a dangerous mixture of anxiety and desperate anticipation. Thalassa leaned over her, gently massaging a cooling, numbing astringent into Eleanor's temples and jawline. The Chrysalis is a thermokinetic process, Thalassa explained smoothly, her voice dropping to a soothing, hypnotic whisper as she quickly secured heavy leather straps securely across Eleanor's wrists, waist, and ankles. You must remain absolutely, perfectly still. We secure you, so the compound sets without microscopic fractures. You will feel a heavy, crushing weight. You will feel intense heat. Do not panic. That is simply the feeling of time reversing. Eleanor nodded blindly, her eyes heavy from the astringent fumes. Just make me beautiful again. Ines stepped forward, carrying the heavy rubber bucket. It didn't contain mud, healing clay, or any natural cosmetic substance known to medical science. It was a proprietary, highly lethal blend of marine-grade fiberglass resin, industrial epoxy, a fast-acting peroxide hardener, and finely milled gypsum powder. With clinical, terrifying efficiency, the two women went to work. Ines began slathering the thick, gray paste over Eleanor's legs, moving upward with cold, mechanical precision. She embedded strips of heavy, woven fiberglass cloth into the wet resin, layering it thickly. Thalassa worked on the torso and arms. The paste was shockingly dense and heavy, pressing Eleanor deep into the leather cushions. Within 3 minutes, the chemical reaction began. The epoxy cross-linked, generating a massive exothermic heat wave. The temperature of the paste spiked dramatically. Eleanor gasped as a heavy sludge wrapping her chest suddenly began to stiffen. It was no longer a pliable paste. It was rapidly turning into stone. Thalassa? Eleanor wheezed, her chest visibly straining against a hardening shell. It's too heavy. I can't expand my ribs. Hush, my sweet, Thalassa murmured, standing directly over her, watching with cold, dead eyes. That is the pressure of perfection. Ines moved to Eleanor's face. She placed 2 small, rigid plastic straws deep into the terrified woman's nostrils. Then, without a second of hesitation, she poured the remaining resin directly over Eleanor's face, sealing her eyes, her mouth, and her ears in total, suffocating darkness. Panic, raw and primal, exploded inside Eleanor's mind. She tried to thrash, to scream, to tear the burning, heavy mass from her face. But she was entombed. The fiberglass shell had cured into an impenetrable, rigid cast. It was stronger than steel. Her arms were firmly locked. Her legs were paralyzed. And worst of all, the hardened resin encased her torso acted like an iron corset. She physically couldn't expand her lungs to take in air. Through the muffled, hardened wall of her own private coffin, she felt Thalassa's manicured fingers gently grip the 2 plastic straws protruding from her nose. Beauty is a sacrifice, Eleanor, Thalassa whispered, her voice vibrating dimly through the hardened plastic. Thalassa pulled the straws out. The wet resin instantly collapsed into the empty nasal cavities, permanently sealing the only remaining airway. Inside the lightless, rigid cocoon, Eleanor Vance began to violently suffocate. Her heart hammered against her restricted ribs like a trapped bird. Her jaw, frozen and silent, paralyzed scream beneath the fiberglass, strained until the muscles tore. For 3 agonizing minutes, she fought a silent, invisible war against an unyielding prison of chemistry. Then her heart gave out, and the wealthy widow faded permanently into the dark. In the Airstream, the jazz record continued to spin. Thalassa calmly wiped a single drop of stray resin from her Chanel skirt, completely unfazed by the murder she had just committed. Ines didn't waste a single second. She checked her silver wristwatch, confirming the exothermic cure was 100% complete. The fiberglass shell was now a flawless, hollow replica of Eleanor's exterior, but the heavy biological matter inside had to be removed. Ines wheeled out a heavy 50-gallon steel drum marked with stark, black corrosive warning labels. It was industrial-grade sodium hydroxide, liquid lye. Armed with heavy rubber aprons, thick face shields, and a mechanical pump, they drilled 2 small holes into the base of the hardened cocoon near the feet. With the flip of a heavy toggle switch, the pump whirred to life. The highly caustic chemical flooded the interior of the fiberglass shell, instantly attacking the soft tissue, fat, and bone locked securely inside. A horrific, bubbling hiss filled the trailer, accompanied by the noxious, overwhelming stench of rapidly dissolving organic matter. The heavy industrial ventilation fans kicked into overdrive, sucking the poisonous fumes out into the humid, indifferent Florida night. By dawn, there'd be nothing left of Eleanor Vance but a brownish, gelatinous chemical. sludge that Ines would simply flush via a heavy hose deep into the Oakhaven swamp. All that remained on the cosmetic chair was a flawless, milky white fiberglass shell. Fused permanently into the chest of the rigid, plastic skin was Eleanor's heavy gold locket. Thalassa removed her gloves and traced her bare finger over the hardened, perfectly smooth fiberglass cheek of the dead woman. Flawless. Thalassa smiled, admiring their very first masterpiece. Now, let's see who else wants to be beautiful. The morning sun over Oakhaven rose like a bruised, humid yellow eye, burning to the thick canopy of the Blackwater Slough. Behind the gleaming silver Airstream, a heavy industrial rubber hose snaked from the underbelly of the trailer directly into the dark, stagnant water of the swamp. Ines Calderon stood by the manifold switch, her face impassive behind a thick rubber respirator. She turned the heavy brass valve. A thick, brownish, highly caustic slurry poured from the hose, dissolving instantly into the murky tannin water. It was the liquefied, biological remains of Eleanor Vance. The swamp, an ecosystem built entirely on rotting consumption, swallowed the town's wealthiest widow without a single bubble of protest. Inside the air-conditioned, lavender-scented sanctuary of Elysium, Thalassa Vane was enjoying her morning espresso and admiring the spoils of their labor. Before Ines had applied the fatal resin to Eleanor's hands the night before, Thalassa had smoothly slid a heavy, vintage diamond and sapphire ring off the widow's right index finger. The chemical reaction might tarnish the platinum setting, my dear, she had purred. Now, the spectacular piece of jewelry rested comfortably on Thalassa's own elegant finger, catching the soft halo lighting of the trailer. But the ring was merely a trinket. The real prize sat on the brushed steel counter, Eleanor's customized crocodile leather purse. Inside, Thalassa found a pre-signed checkbook, heavy wads of emergency cash, and a pristine pad of Eleanor's monogrammed stationery. With the practiced, fluid strokes of a master forger, Thalassa drafted an urgent, breathless letter to Eleanor's estate lawyer. The widow claimed she had been struck by a sudden, overwhelming desire to see the French Riviera and would be traveling abroad indefinitely. She demanded a large sum of liquid assets be wired to a holding account in Miami, an account Thalassa had opened a month prior under a fictitious name. The town of Oakhaven bought the lie, without hesitation. After all, Eleanor was known for her eccentric, erratic bouts of manic depression. Running away to Europe was perfectly in character. The first kill had been highly profitable, but Thalassa's appetite was far from satiated. The trap was still open, and the scent of vanity in Oakhaven was intoxicating. By mid-July, the town was consumed by the upcoming Miss Florida pageant. Oakhaven's reigning Miss Citrus Queen was 19-year-old Darlene Montgomery. Darlene was a creature built entirely of spun sugar, peroxide blonde curls, and vicious, cutthroat ambition. Beneath her perfect, pageant-winning smile lay a deep, paranoid terror of physical imperfection. She scrutinized every microscopic pore on her face, terrified that a single blemish would cost her the statewide crown. When Darlene heard whispers at the country club about the exclusive Chrysalis treatment that had supposedly sent Eleanor Vance to Europe looking 20 years younger, she didn't just walk into the trap. She sprinted. Darlene arrived at the Airstream late on a Tuesday night, sneaking through the back alleys, so her rival pageant girls wouldn't discover her secret weapon. She was arrogant, demanding, and treated Thalassa and Ines like hired help. "I need absolute perfection," Darlene commanded, dropping her silk robe onto the sterile floor and aggressively settling into a heavy leather cosmetological chair. "The pageant is in 3 weeks. My skin has to look like porcelain. No pores, no lines, just glass." "Glass," Thalassa repeated, a cold, predatory smile spreading across her dark, Mediterranean features. "That is exactly what we specialize in, Darlene." The murder process had evolved. Ines, ever the meticulous scientist, had refined her chemical formula. She had tweaked the catalyst ratio and the marine-grade epoxy, shortening the curing time from 3 minutes down to a terrifying 90 seconds. Furthermore, she had lowered the exothermic heat output. The resin would no longer burn the victim's skin, preventing the fiberglass shell from microfracturing due to thermal shock. It was a faster, smoother, and much more efficient death. Thalassa strapped Darlene's wrists and ankles to the heavy chair. When the pageant queen complained about the tight leather restraints, Thalassa simply whispered, "It is vital for spinal alignment, darling. True beauty requires absolute symmetry." Ines stepped out from the shadows, her latex-covered hands holding the heavy bucket of wet gray resin. Without a word, she began applying the thick, heavy sludge. She worked with astonishing speed, layering the heavy woven fiberglass strips over Darlene's legs, torso, and arms. "God, it smells like a boatyard in here," Darlene complained, coughing as the sharp fumes of the peroxide hardener filled the small trailer. "And it's so heavy." "Just relax," Thalassa soothed, stepping behind the chair and gently massaging Darlene's scalp. "The weight is pushing the impurities out of your cells." 60 seconds in, the chemical reaction peaked. The gray sludge flashed into rigid, unyielding plastic. Darlene's eyes went wide with sudden, primal terror as she realized she couldn't expand her ribs. The heavy fiberglass corset had instantly locked her chest cavity in place. "Wait," Darlene gasped, her chest straining violently against the immovable shell. I can't breathe. Get it off. Get it off me." "Hold still," Thalassa commanded, her velvet voice dropping its warmth, revealing the cold steel underneath. Ines moved in with the final batch of resin. She didn't bother with the plastic nasal straws this time. Darlene's mouth was open in a panicked, desperate scream when Ines poured the thick, suffocating paste directly over her face. The heavy resin filled Darlene's open mouth, sliding down the back of her throat and instantly curing into a solid, impenetrable block of plastic. Her scream was permanently entombed. Inside the lightless, airless shell, the pageant queen thrashed violently against the leather straps, her eyes trapped open in the dark beneath the hardened fiberglass. The chemical casket held her in a merciless, unbreakable grip. 90 seconds later, Darlene Montgomery suffocated to death, perfectly preserved in her vanity. Later that night, as a heavy industrial eye bubbled and hissed inside Darlene's hollowed-out fiberglass shell, Thalassa sat at the metal counter with a stolen portable typewriter. She carefully forged a letter from Darlene to her overbearing stage mother. The note was beautifully cruel. "I met a Hollywood producer at the diner. I'm going to California. Don't try to find me. I was born to be a star." By 3 a.m., Ines was hosing the liquefied remains of the beauty queen into the swamp. The second empty, flawless fiberglass shell, forever frozen in a muffled scream, was loaded into a weighted canvas sack and dropped into the deepest, darkest trench of the Blackwater Slough. The perfect crime was running flawlessly. But in a small town like Oakhaven, perfection is fragile, and a single piece of stolen jewelry was about to crack the glass. By mid-August, the Florida heat had become an oppressive, physical weight. The air in Oakhaven was thick with humidity, the drone of cicadas, and the smell of overripe oranges rotting on the ground. Inside the Oakhaven diner, the ceiling fans lazily pushed the hot air around as Arthur Pendleton wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. Arthur was a traveling jewelry broker, a man who made his living navigating the delicate vanities of wealthy Southern wives. He possessed a sharp, calculating eye for carats, clarity, and human weakness. He knew the secrets of half the women in Oakhaven because he knew exactly what they bought and who was secretly pawning their family silver to cover gambling debts. He was sipping a lukewarm Coca-Cola when the bell above the diner door jingled. Thalassa Vane glided in, untouched by the punishing heat, wearing a crisp, ivory linen dress. She ordered an iced coffee to go. As she reached into her tailored handbag to extract a crisp dollar bill, the harsh fluorescent lights of the diner caught her right hand. Arthur stopped chewing his ice, his sharp, predatory gaze locked onto her index finger. Resting, there was a spectacular, custom-set platinum ring featuring a heavy, azure-cut sapphire flanked by twin baguette diamonds. It wasn't just a beautiful piece of jewelry. It was a highly specific one. Arthur knew every millimeter of that ring. 3 years ago, he had personally sourced that exact sapphire in New York and had the platinum filigree custom designed for Eleanor Vance. Eleanor had sworn she would be buried in it. Yet, here was a mysterious, exotic stranger wearing it while buying iced coffee, weeks after the wealthy widow had supposedly fled to the French Riviera. Arthur possessed the worst combination of traits for a man in his position. He was exceptionally observant, and he was exceptionally greedy. He didn't go to the police. He smelled a blackmail opportunity. He slid out of his booth, adjusting his tie, and intercepted Thalassa near the exit. He tipped his fedora, flashing a brilliant salesman smile. "Excuse me, miss." Arthur Pendleton. I couldn't help but notice that magnificent sapphire. Ash-share cut, flawless clarity. An exquisite piece. Thalassa's dark eyes flicked over him, instantly calculating his threat level. She offered a cool, practiced smile. "Thank you. It's a family heirloom, brought over from Athens." "Fascinating," Arthur replied, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur, "because it bears a striking resemblance to a piece I personally designed for Mrs. Eleanor Vance. The platinum filigree is unmistakable. I'd know my own jeweler's mark anywhere." For a fraction of a second, the charismatic warmth vanished from Thalassa's face, replaced by a cold, reptilian stillness. Then the smile returned, sharper than before. "How remarkable. I'm staying at the Silver Airstream near the Slough. Why don't you stop by tonight, Mr. Pendleton? Perhaps you could appraise it for me over a glass of bourbon." Arthur grinned. "I'd be delighted." He arrived at Elysium at 10 p.m. The Blackwater Slough was pitch black, alive with the croaking of bullfrogs. He stepped up to the gleaming metal door, expecting negotiation, a heavy envelope of hush money, or perhaps a violent seduction. He knocked twice. The door swung open. Thalassa stood in the dim, lavender-scented light, holding a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. "Right on time, Arthur. Come in." Arthur stepped into the air-conditioned trailer. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never materialized. From the shadows behind the door, Ines Calderon stepped forward. She didn't use a heavy wrench or a gun. She simply pressed a heavily soaked, industrial-grade ether rag violently against Arthur's nose and mouth. The traveling salesman thrashed, dropping his leather briefcase, his hands clawing at Ines's thick rubber apron. But the Cuban chemist's grip was like an iron vice. Within 10 seconds, Arthur's eyes rolled back, and his heavy body went entirely limp. When Arthur regained consciousness, the world was a nightmare of crushing weight and chemical heat. He was strapped tightly to the heavy leather cosmetological chair. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat. He was already entombed from the chest down. Ines hadn't bothered with the slow, meticulous layering she used for the women. She was rapidly slathering thick, heavy, industrial marine epoxy directly over his suit, using broad, violent strokes to pack the woven fiberglass tight against his ribcage. "You should have kept walking, Arthur," Thalassa whispered, standing over him. She casually slipped the sapphire ring off her finger and dropped it onto the steel tray. "Curiosity is such a vulgar, expensive habit." Arthur thrashed violently, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. The resin was already undergoing its exothermic cure, heating up rapidly, hardening into a solid, unyielding shell around his torso. He felt his ribs being locked into place. The air was squeezed from his lungs. Ines moved to his face. She didn't use the nasal straws. She didn't care about preserving his features for a perfect cast. She hoisted the heavy rubber bucket and simply poured the remaining gray, viscous sludge directly over Arthur's face. The heavy compound filled his mouth, his nose, and coated his eyes. In the absolute, suffocating darkness beneath the hardening plastic, Arthur Pendleton fought a violent, agonizing battle for oxygen that he was destined to lose. His body seized against the heavy leather straps, his muffled, gurgling cries completely absorbed by the soundproof walls of the trailer. 2 minutes later, the salesman was permanently silenced, encased alive in a crude, horrifying chrysalis of industrial fiberglass. 3 hours later, under the cover of a humid, starless night, Thalassa and Ines completed their grim work. They didn't bother using the corrosive lye on him. He wasn't a piece of art. He was garbage. They dragged the heavy, resin-encased corpse of Arthur Pendleton out to his own 1960 Buick Invicta. They shoved his rigid, plastic-coated body into the trunk, loaded the vehicle with heavy cinder blocks, and drove it to the deepest, most treacherous embankment of the swamp. With a heavy splash, the Buick sank beneath the dark, algae-covered water, disappearing into the mud. Thalassa brushed the dirt from her Chanel skirt, looking out over the ripples. "Such a pity," she murmured. "He really did have an eye for fine things." By late September 1962, the oppressive Florida summer had not broken. Instead, it had fermented. The air in Oakhaven was thick, stagnant, and heavy with the cloying, fermented stench of dropped citrus rotting in the sprawling, sun-baked groves. But the rot in the groves was nothing compared to the rot sitting inside the gleaming silver Airstream parked by the Blackwater Slough. Thalassa and Ines had accumulated a staggering amount of wealth in just 3 months. They had the Vance estate's liquid assets, the Montgomery Girls Pageant Fund, and Arthur Pendleton's entire briefcase of high-end broker cash. They should have packed up the Airstream, hitched it to the Cadillac, and disappeared into the neon haze of Miami. But greed is a parasite that eventually eats its host, and Thalassa Vane had just spotted the biggest prize of all. Clara Sterling was 24 years old and the sole heir to the Sterling Citrus Empire, a monopoly that controlled half the agricultural exports in the state. She lived in a sprawling, gated fortress of white stucco and wrought iron, entirely isolated from the town. Clara was not driven by the shallow, frantic vanity of the country club wives. She was crushed by a profound, clinical depression. She was a ghost haunting her own life, desperate to shed the suffocating expectations of her tyrannical billionaire father, William Sterling. When Clara quietly visited the Elysium trailer on a humid Monday afternoon, Thalassa instantly recognized that her usual sales pitch about youth and beauty would fail. Clara didn't want to be beautiful. She wanted to disappear. "I feel like I'm wearing a skin that doesn't belong to me," Clara whispered, sitting in the pristine, chrome-lined trailer, her pale fingers twisting a massive, one-of-kind canary yellow diamond pendant around her neck. The Sterling Star. "I just want to shed it. I want to step out of this life and leave her behind." Thalassa leaned in, her dark eyes swimming with artificial, calculated empathy. She reached out and gently held Clara's trembling hands. "That is exactly what the Chrysalis is, my sweet girl. It is not cosmetics. It is a rebirth. We will encase the pain, the burden, the old Clara. When the shell breaks, you will be entirely brand new, untethered." Clara swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. She handed Thalassa an envelope containing $10,000 in untraceable bearer bonds, a fortune in 1962. "Tonight," Clara pleaded. "Please." At midnight, the Airstream was prepped for its most lucrative procedure yet. The Miles Davis record spun silently on the turntable. The air was thick with a sharp, stinging scent of industrial acetone and crushed lavender. Clara stripped down to the disposable silk robe. Around her neck, the breathtaking canary diamond caught the harsh surgical halo light. Thalassa strapped the heiress to the heavy leather cosmetological chair, whispering soothing, hypnotic affirmations about freedom and metamorphosis. Ines Calderon stepped out from the shadows, her eyes cold and blank above her heavy rubber respirator. She carried the bucket of freshly catalyzed marine epoxy. She had perfected the formula to a terrifying degree. The resin was now incredibly dense, formulated to cure into an unbreakable, stone-like shell in exactly 60 seconds. Ines began applying the gray, viscous sludge to Clara's legs, embedding the heavy strips of woven fiberglass. Clara closed her eyes, letting out a long, shuddering sigh as the heavy pace encased her torso. At first, she welcomed the crushing weight. It felt like a heavy, grounding blanket. But at the 30-second mark, the chemical reaction violently accelerated. The heat spiked. The resin flashed from a pliable paste into rigid, immovable plastic. Clara's eyes snapped open. The therapeutic pressure had instantly transformed into a lethal, suffocating vice. The fiberglass corset locked around her ribcage, completely paralyzing her diaphragm. "Wait!" Clara choked out, true panic finally piercing her melancholy. She strained against the heavy leather straps, her knuckles turning white. I changed my mind. It's too tight. Stop." Thalassa stood directly over her, her beautiful face entirely devoid of humanity. "You wanted to leave her behind, Clara," she whispered, her voice like ice. "It is time to say goodbye." Ines didn't hesitate. She hoisted the bucket and poured the remaining heavy resin directly over Clara's face. The thick sludge filled the heiress's mouth and nose, instantly curing into a solid block. Beneath the lightless, airtight shell, Clara fought with the terrifying, primal strength of a dying animal. The cosmetological chair groaned and squeaked against its floor anchors as the Heiress violently convulsed in the dark. But the fiberglass cocoon was absolute. 60 seconds later, the violent thrashing ceased. The Heiress was dead. By 3 a.m., the corrosive sodium hydroxide had done its gruesome work, dissolving Clara Sterling into a dark, chemical slurry that Ines pumped directly into the Blackwater Slough. All that remained was the flawless, milky white fiberglass shell. Fused permanently into the chest of the rigid plastic skin was a magnificent canary yellow diamond. Thalassa sat at her portable typewriter and composed a tragic, poetic suicide note, perfectly mimicking Clara's elegant handwriting. She claimed the pressure of the Sterling name had finally broken her, and she was walking into the ocean to find peace. Thalassa mailed it the next morning, expecting the town to mourn quietly while she and Ines packed the Airstream to finally vanish. It was the most catastrophic mistake they could have made. William Sterling did not mourn quietly. When he received the letter on Thursday morning, he didn't just read the words. He analyzed them. Clara was left-handed, causing her cursive T's to slant at a very specific, aggressive angle. The forged letter had the smooth, right-handed loops of a professional. Furthermore, Clara would never, under any circumstances, leave behind her beloved golden retriever, which was found whimpering in her bedroom. William Sterling didn't call the local sheriff. He called the governor of Florida. By Friday evening, Oakhaven was no longer a sleepy, forgotten citrus town. It was a war zone. State police cruisers blockaded the highways. Helicopters chopped through the humid air over the swamps. Search dogs howled in the orange groves. The quiet, invisible shield that Thalassa and Ines had relied on was instantly shattered by the deafening roar of a billionaire's wrath. The town was locked down. No one was allowed to leave. And in the midst of the swirling chaos, a hardened, skeptical man stepped out of an unmarked Plymouth Fury, lighting a cheap cigarette and looking directly toward the historical district. Detective Silas Ward had arrived, and he was about to smell the acetone. Silas Ward was a man composed entirely of sharp angles, unfiltered nicotine, and a deeply ingrained suspicion of human nature. At 45, the Florida State Detective had seen enough bodies pulled from the Everglades to know that monsters didn't hide under beds. They smiled at you in the grocery store. He drove an unmarked 1959 Plymouth Fury that constantly smelled of old coffee and cheap cigars. He wore a rumpled gray suit that completely ignored the crushing 90-degree heat of Oakhaven. When William Sterling's frantic call reached the governor's office, Ward was the man they sent to bypass the incompetent local sheriff. By Saturday morning, the Oakhaven police precinct was a circus of ringing telephones, panicked deputies, and a furious billionaire demanding answers. Ward ignored the noise. He pinned 3 photographs to the corkboard in the center of the squad room: Eleanor Vance, Darlene Montgomery, and Clara Sterling. He also pinned a small, blurry photograph of a missing traveling jewelry broker named Arthur Pendleton, though the local police insisted the man had simply moved on to the next town. Ward stared at the board, exhaling a thin stream of gray smoke. For people vanished in a town of 3,000 within the span of 3 months. No bodies, no ransom notes, no bloodstains, just impossibly neat, perfectly timed departures that made absolutely no sense. They didn't run away, Ward muttered to the sweating, overweight local sheriff, who was nervously mopping his brow. People who run away take their dogs. They take their favorite coats. They make mistakes. These disappearances are surgically clean. Someone is erasing them. But the letters, detective, the sheriff protested weakly, pointing a fat finger at the evidence bags containing the supposed farewell notes. The handwriting analysis on the Vance woman is a very good forgery, Ward interrupted, his voice like gravel. Clara Sterling's letter was written by a right-handed person. Clara was left-handed. The killer is meticulous, but they don't know the victims intimately. They only know what the victims present to the world. Ward left the suffocating precinct and began walking the sun-baked streets of Oakhaven. He didn't interview the grieving families. They only knew the lies the victims told themselves. He interviewed the gossips, the diner waitresses, the country club bartenders. He was looking for the invisible thread that connected a wealthy widow, a vain pageant queen, a depressed heiress, and a greedy salesman. By Tuesday afternoon, Ward found his thread sitting at the counter of the Oakhaven diner. "It's the Vanity detective," whispered Mrs. Gable, a terrifyingly observant 80-year-old woman who lived across from the country club. She was aggressively stirring a cup of black tea. Eleanor Vance was terrified of wrinkles. Darlene Montgomery thought her pores were a tragedy. And that sterling girl, she just wanted to shed her own skin. Ward leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "And where do women in this town go to shed their skin, Mrs. Gable?" The old woman pointed a bony, arthritic finger toward the historical district, where the manicured lawns met the wild, tangled edge of the Blackwater Slough, the Silver Bullet, the Elysium trailer. They go in looking desperate and they come out. Well, they don't seem to come out at all lately, do they? Ward crushed a cigarette under his heel. He walked the 2 miles to the edge of the swamp. The 1958 Cadillac Eldorado and the gleaming 30-foot Airstream trailer sat like a spaceship that had crash-landed in a jungle. The polished aluminum exterior reflected the harsh Florida sun, perfectly hiding whatever horrors lay within. Ward didn't announce himself. He didn't flash his badge. He simply walked up to the heavy metal door and knocked loudly. The door swung open, revealing a wall of aggressive, artificially cooled air. Thalassa Vane stood there, a vision of dark, Mediterranean elegance in a tailored crimson blouse. Her smile was instantaneous, flawless, and entirely dead behind the eyes. "Good afternoon, officer," Thalassa purred, her velvet voice dripping with practiced charm. "How can I help you? Are we parked in a restricted zone?" Ward didn't smile back. He didn't step inside. He simply stood on the threshold, letting his eyes sweep the gleaming mid-century modern interior. He saw the frosted glass, the white leather cosmetological chair securely anchored to the floorboards, and the high-fidelity phonograph. But was it what he saw that triggered every alarm bell in his head? It was what he smelled. Beneath the overwhelming, cloying scent of crushed lavender, Ward's experienced nose detected something sharp, chemical, and distinctly industrial. It wasn't the soft, powdery smell of face creams or astringents. It was a harsh, biting odor of marine-grade epoxy resin, peroxide hardener, and the faint, unmistakable metallic tang of liquid lye. It was the smell of a boatyard, not a beauty salon. "Detective Silas Ward, State Police," he rasped, finally producing his badge. "I'm looking into the disappearance of Clara Sterling. Her family mentioned she might have sought your services recently." Thalassa didn't flinch. Her breathing didn't hitch. She simply sighed, a perfect portrait of sympathetic concern. "Oh, the poor, sweet girl. Yes, she was here on Monday. She was deeply distressed. She spoke of the suffocating weight of her father's empire. She said she was leaving for the coast. I tried to counsel her, detective, but she was entirely resolute." From the shadows in the rear of the trailer, Ines Calderon stepped forward. She wore her heavy white clinical coat and latex gloves. She didn't speak. She just stared at Ward with cold, flat, reptilian eyes. Ward held Ines's gaze for 3 long seconds. He recognized the look. It was the look of a predator assessing a threat. "You use some interesting compounds for skincare, ladies," Ward said casually, nodding toward a heavy, steel-reinforced storage cabinet behind Ines. "Smells like you're building a yacht in here, not giving facials." For a microscopic fraction of a second, the flawless mask on Thalassa's face slipped. The velvet warmth vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine, murderous calculation. Then the smile returned, sharper than before. "Our Chrysalis treatment uses proprietary, imported thermokinetic polymers, detective," Thalassa explained smoothly. "It is highly experimental and highly effective. The scent can be bracing, but the results speak for themselves." Ward tipped his fedora, stepping back from the door. He had seen enough. He didn't have a warrant. He didn't have bodies, and he didn't have a confession. But he had instinct. "I'm sure they do, Miss Vane," Ward said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm sure your results are absolutely permanent. Don't leave town." He turned and walked back toward his Plymouth Fury. The trap was finally visible. Now, he just needed to find the bones buried underneath it. The Florida night was thick, absolute, and suffocatingly silent. The deafening chorus of cicadas had abruptly ceased, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. For police cruisers, their headlights extinguished and sirens dead, rolled down the dirt access road behind the historical district like metal phantoms. At the front of the convoy, Detective Silas Ward gripped the steering wheel of his Plymouth Fury, his knuckles white, his jaw set like a steel trap. He parked 100 yards away, hidden beneath the draping canopy of ancient oak trees. The officers stepped out of their vehicles into the oppressive heat, their boots sinking silently into the damp earth. They drew their service weapons. Ward chambered around his .38 special, the metallic click echoing sharply in the humid air. Ahead of them, the silver Airstream glowed under the moonlight. The massive 1958 Cadillac Eldorado was already hooked to the trailer hitch. The engine wasn't running yet, but the trap was packed and ready to vanish. Inside Elysium, the atmosphere was pure, frantic adrenaline. Thalassa Vane, her perfectly tailored crimson blouse slightly wrinkled, was violently shoving thick stacks of untraceable bearer bonds, emergency cash, and stolen jewelry into a heavy leather valise. Her dark, Mediterranean eyes darted nervously toward the frosted windows. The illusion of the elegant cosmetologist was completely gone. She was a predator sensing the hounds closing in. In the rear of the trailer, Ines Calderon was frantically destroying evidence. The silent Cuban chemist was pouring smaller glass vials of highly reactive MEKP hardener and leftover epoxy catalyst down the tiny aluminum sink, her hands moving with frantic, jerky precision. The air inside the trailer was a toxic, eye-watering cloud of acetone, lavender, and raw fear. "Hurry, Ines," Thalassa hissed, snapping the brass latches of the valise shut. "That detective knows too much. If we can just reach the interstate by 3 o'clock, we disappear into Miami. They have nothing to hold us on. Nothing." She was wrong. The heavy aluminum door of the Airstream suddenly bowed inward with a deafening crack. Ward's heavy leather boot struck the door lock directly on the deadbolt. The metal frame shrieked. He kicked it a second time, putting the entire weight of his body behind it. The latch violently sheared off, and the door burst open, slamming hard against the interior chrome wall. "State police. Nobody move." Ward roared, plunging into the narrow, brightly lit space, his revolver leveled directly at Thalassa's chest. For uniformed deputies flooded in behind him, clogging the elegant entryway, their shotguns raised. Thalassa froze, her manicured hands hovering over the leather valise. For a fraction of a second, absolute panic flashed across her face. But then the icy, arrogant facade snapped back into place. She slowly raised her hands, a condescending smirk playing on her lips. "Detective Ward," what an utterly barbaric way to knock. "Do you have a warrant for this outrage?" "I don't need one for a fleeing felon," Ward growled, advancing into the trailer. "Put your hands on the wall. Now!" But Ines Calderon had no intention of surrendering. From the shadows of her chemical station, the chemist spun around. Her dark eyes were wide and feral above her heavy rubber respirator. In her right hand, she gripped a heavy, half-liter Erlenmeyer flask filled with highly concentrated sulfuric acid, a corrosive compound she used to neutralize the light tanks. Without a sound, Ines lunged forward, hurling the heavy glass flask directly at Ward's head. "Watch out!" a deputy yelled. Ward ducked violently to the left. The flask sailed past his ear, shattering violently against the reinforced doorframe. A highly caustic splash of thick, burning acid sprayed across the entryway. It instantly ate through the wood paneling, filling the trailer with a horrific, hissing sound and a cloud of acrid, choking white smoke. Droplets of the acid caught a young deputy's forearm. He screamed in agony as the chemical instantly burned through his uniform shirt, searing his flesh. Chaos erupted. Ward lunged through the smoke, tackling Ines to the linoleum floor. The Cuban woman fought like a cornered wolverine, clawing at Ward's eyes, her latex gloves squeaking violently against the floorboards. She possessed an unnatural, terrifying strength fueled by pure panic. Ward drove his knee hard into her spine, pinning her down. He wrestled her arms behind her back, the heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut over her wrists with a definitive metallic snap. "Hold her down." Ward barked, gasping for breath, the toxic fumes burning his lungs. Across the room, 2 officers had already pinned Thalassa to the chrome counter. She didn't fight physically, but she spit a venomous Greek curse at them, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The raid was over in less than 60 seconds. The Airstream was secured. Ward slowly stood up, brushing the dirt from his rumpled suit. He looked around a pristine, mid-century modern sanctuary. It was an altar of vanity, and it was about to be dismantled piece by piece. Tear apart, Ward ordered his men. Check every panel, every cabinet, every floorboard. For the next 2 hours, the police systematically destroyed the beautiful illusion of Elysium. They slashed open the white leather cosmetological chair, revealing the heavy, reinforced steel straps designed specifically to hold a thrashing, dying human being in place. They breached the locked steel cabinets, pulling out 50-gallon drums of marine-grade epoxy, massive rolls of woven fiberglass cloth, and heavy vats of caustic sodium hydroxide. But it was what Ward found beneath a false floorboard under the closet that sealed their fate. He pulled out a heavy, steel lockbox. Inside, wrapped meticulously in velvet, were the trophies. Ward laid them out on the chrome table, his jaw tightening with every item. Eleanor Vance's custom crocodile leather purse, Darlene Montgomery's silver, diamond-encrusted Miss Citrus tiara, Arthur Pendleton's leather sales ledger, and finally, glowing violently under the harsh fluorescent lights, Clara Sterling's massive canary yellow diamond pendant. Ward picked up the heavy diamond, holding it up so Thalassa could see it. She was sitting handcuffed on the ruined leather chair, her expression completely unreadable. "You got sloppy, Thalassa," Ward said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You couldn't resist the shine. This is enough to put you in the electric chair." Thalassa simply laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the metal walls. She leaned forward, her dark eyes locked onto Ward's. "You have jewelry, detective. You have industrial glue. You have a very messy trailer." Thalassa sneered, her voice dripping with supreme, arrogant confidence. "But you have a massive problem. In the state of Florida, you cannot prove a homicide without a body. Whereas Clara, whereas Eleanor, you have no corpses, Ward. You have no blood. You have absolutely nothing but circumstantial trinkets. We will be out on bail by tomorrow morning." Ward didn't argue. He knew she was legally right. A clever defense attorney could claim the jewelry was given as payment. Without bodies, it was just a robbery case. But Ward wasn't looking at Thalassa anymore. He was looking past her, through the shattered Airstream door, out into the dark, tangled expanse of the Blackwater Slough. He walked over to the heavy rubber hose attached to the chemical. The Florida night was thick, absolute, and suffocatingly silent. The deafening chorus of cicadas had abruptly ceased, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. For police cruisers, their headlights extinguished and sirens dead, rolled down the dirt access road behind the historical district like metal phantoms. At the front of the convoy, Detective Silas Ward gripped the steering wheel of his Plymouth Fury, his knuckles white, his jaw set like a steel trap. He parked 100 yards away, hidden beneath the draping canopy of ancient oak trees. The officers stepped out of their vehicles into the oppressive heat, their boots sinking silently into the damp earth. They drew their service weapons. Ward chambered around his .38 special, the metallic click echoing sharply in the humid air. Ahead of them, the silver Airstream glowed under the moonlight. The massive 1958 Cadillac Eldorado was already hooked to the trailer hitch. The engine wasn't running yet, but the trap was packed and ready to vanish. Inside Elysium, the atmosphere was pure, frantic adrenaline. Thalassa Vane, her perfectly tailored crimson blouse slightly wrinkled, was violently shoving thick stacks of untraceable bearer bonds, emergency cash, and stolen jewelry into a heavy leather valise. Her dark, Mediterranean eyes darted nervously toward the frosted windows. The illusion of the elegant cosmetologist was completely gone. She was a predator sensing the hounds closing in. In the rear of the trailer, Ines Calderon was frantically destroying evidence. The silent Cuban chemist was pouring smaller glass vials of highly reactive MEKP hardener and leftover epoxy catalyst down the tiny aluminum sink, her hands moving with frantic, jerky precision. The air inside the trailer was a toxic, eye-watering cloud of acetone, lavender, and raw fear. "Hurry, Ines," Thalassa hissed, snapping the brass latches of the valise shut. "That detective knows too much. If we can just reach the interstate by 3 o'clock, we disappear into Miami. They have nothing to hold us on." Nothing. She was wrong. The heavy aluminum door of the Airstream suddenly bowed inward with a deafening crack. Ward's heavy leather boot struck the door lock directly on the deadbolt. The metal frame shrieked. He kicked it a second time, putting the entire weight of his body behind it. The latch violently sheared off, and the door burst open, slamming hard against the interior chrome wall. "State police. Nobody move." Ward roared, plunging into the narrow, brightly lit space, his revolver leveled directly at Thalassa's chest. For uniformed deputies flooded in behind him, clogging the elegant entryway, their shotguns raised. Thalassa froze, her manicured hands hovering over the leather valise. For a fraction of a second, absolute panic flashed across her face. But then the icy, arrogant facade snapped back into place. She slowly raised her hands, a condescending smirk playing on her lips. "Detective Ward, what an utterly barbaric way to knock. Do you have a warrant for this outrage?" "I don't need one for a fleeing felon," Ward growled, advancing into the trailer. "Put your hands on the wall. Now!" But Ines Calderon had no intention of surrendering. From the shadows of her chemical station, the chemist spun around. Her dark eyes were wide and feral above her heavy rubber respirator. In her right hand, she gripped a heavy, half-liter Erlenmeyer flask filled with highly concentrated sulfuric acid, a corrosive compound she used to neutralize the light tanks. Without a sound, Ines lunged forward, hurling the heavy glass flask directly at Ward's head. "Watch out!" a deputy yelled. Ward ducked violently to the left. The flask sailed past his ear, shattering violently against the reinforced doorframe. A highly caustic splash of thick, burning acid sprayed across the entryway. It instantly ate through the wood paneling, filling the trailer with a horrific, hissing sound and a cloud of acrid, choking white smoke. Droplets of the acid caught a young deputy's forearm. He screamed in agony as the chemical instantly burned through his uniform shirt, searing his flesh. Chaos erupted. Ward lunged through the smoke, tackling Ines to the linoleum floor. The Cuban woman fought like a cornered wolverine, clawing at Ward's eyes, her latex gloves squeaking violently against the floorboards. She possessed an unnatural, terrifying strength fueled by pure panic. Ward drove his knee hard into her spine, pinning her down. He wrestled her arms behind her back, the heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut over her wrists with a definitive metallic snap. "Hold her down." Ward barked, gasping for breath, the toxic fumes burning his lungs. Across the room, 2 officers had already pinned Thalassa to the chrome counter. She didn't fight physically, but she spit a venomous Greek curse at them, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The raid was over in less than 60 seconds. The Airstream was secured. Ward slowly stood up, brushing the dirt from his rumpled suit. He looked around the pristine, mid-century modern sanctuary. It was an altar of vanity, and it was about to be dismantled piece by piece. "Tear apart," Ward ordered his men. "Check every panel, every cabinet, every floorboard." For the next 2 hours, the police systematically destroyed the beautiful illusion of Elysium. They slashed open the white leather cosmetological chair, revealing the heavy, reinforced steel straps designed specifically to hold a thrashing, dying human being in place. They breached the locked steel cabinets, pulling out 50-gallon drums of marine-grade epoxy, massive rolls of woven fiberglass cloth, and heavy vats of caustic sodium hydroxide. But it was what Ward found beneath a false floorboard under the closet that sealed their fate. He pulled out a heavy, steel lockbox. Inside, wrapped meticulously in velvet, were the trophies. Ward laid them out on the chrome table, his jaw tightening with every item. Eleanor Vance's custom crocodile leather purse, Darlene Montgomery's silver, diamond-encrusted Miss Citrus tiara, Arthur Pendleton's leather sales ledger, and finally, glowing violently under the harsh fluorescent lights, Clara Sterling's massive canary yellow diamond pendant. Ward picked up the heavy diamond, holding it up so Thalassa could see it. She was sitting handcuffed on the ruined leather chair, her expression completely unreadable. "You got sloppy, Thalassa," Ward said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You couldn't resist the shine. This is enough to put you in the electric chair." Thalassa simply laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the metal walls. She leaned forward, her dark eyes locked onto Ward's. "You have jewelry, detective. You have industrial glue. You have a very messy trailer." Thalassa sneered, her voice dripping with supreme, arrogant confidence. "But you have a massive problem. In the state of Florida, you cannot prove a homicide without a body. Where's Clara? Where's Eleanor? You have no corpses, Ward. You have no blood. You have absolutely nothing but circumstantial trinkets. We will be out on bail by tomorrow morning." Ward didn't argue. He knew she was legally right. A clever defense attorney could claim the jewelry was given as payment. Without bodies, it was just a robbery case. But Ward wasn't looking at Thalassa anymore. He was looking past her, through the shattered Airstream door, out into the dark, tangled expanse of the Blackwater Slough. He walked over to the heavy rubber hose attached to the chemical pump, tracing it as it slithered out the back of the trailer and disappeared directly into the murky, algae-covered water of the swamp. He turned back to the two killers, a grim, terrifying realization dawning on his face. He finally understood how they had vanished to flesh. "I don't need a body, Thalassa," Ward whispered softly, looking at the dark water. "I just need the casts." The dawn over Blackwater Slough broke like a fever. The oppressive, humid heat of Florida morning quickly burned away the lingering chemical fog of the night raid, but the stench of sulfur, rot, and industrial acetone remained heavily anchored to the soil. The Elysium Airstream was now a stripped and gutted crime scene, surrounded by yellow police tape and swarming with state investigators. Detective Silas Ward stood at the edge of the murky water, his rumpled suit clinging to his sweat-drenched shoulders. He held a rolled-up topographical map he had just pried from a false backing in Ines Calderon's chemical storage locker. Ines was a brilliant chemist, but like all scientists, she suffered from a fatal flaw. She documented everything. The map was a meticulous nautical chart of the Blackwater Slough, detailing depth soundings, underwater root systems, and current flows. Scattered across the dark blue ink of the deepest trenches were 5 distinct, red-penciled X's. Just as Ward was studying the coordinates, the heavy tires of a local sheriff's cruiser crunched down the dirt access road. The overweight Oakhaven sheriff stumbled out, his face the color of spoiled milk. He was clutching his stomach, looking as though he might be sick. "Ward," the sheriff gasped, pointing a trembling finger back toward the town. "You need to come to the precinct. A gator trapper named Bo Miller just dragged something out of reeds. He thought it was a mannequin. But Ward, it's got a gold locket baked right into its chest. And there's hair in the plastic." Ward's eyes darted from the pale sheriff down to the map in his hands. One of the red X's was positioned in the shallow reeds near the northern bank, exactly where Bo Miller hunted. The swamp had rejected the first body. Now, Ward was going to rip the rest of them out. "Call the state police dive team," Ward commanded, his voice as cold and hard as the fiberglass he was hunting. "Bring heavy winches. Bring floodlights. We are dragging the bottom of the slough." By noon, the swamp was a militarized zone. For police pontoon boats idled over the deep, tannin-stained trenches marked on Ines's map. Divers in heavy black neoprene suits and yellow oxygen tanks plunged into the zero-visibility, alligator-infested water. It was treacherous, blind work. They had to feel their way through feet of suffocating muck, rotting cypress logs, and tangled Spanish moss. At 1:15 p.m., the radio on Ward's bell crackled. "Surface. We've got a heavy snag at 40 feet. Weighted canvas sack. Hooking the winch cable now." The heavy diesel engine of the pontoon boat roared. The thick steel cable snapped taut, dripping dark, muddy water. Slowly, agonizingly, the mechanical winch dragged the heavy object up from the lightless depths. A massive, algae-covered canvas sack broke the surface, smelling of ancient decay and a sharp, unnatural chemical tang. Over the next 4 hours, the divers pulled up 3 more weighted sacks and eventually the rusted mud-caked chassis of Arthur Pendleton's 1960 Buick Invicta. They hauled the grim Harvest onto the grassy bank behind the Elysium trailer. Dr. Heiress Thorne, the forensic chemist from Miami, had arrived by helicopter and immediately set up a makeshift morgue on the lawn, laying out heavy blue tarps under the punishing sun. With a heavy utility knife, Ward sliced open the thick, rotting canvas of the first sack. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the ring of hardened police officers. Even Ward, a man who thought he had seen the absolute worst of human depravity, felt the blood drain from his face. Lying on the blue tarp was a translucent, milky white sarcophagus made of industrial fiberglass. It was a flawless, three-dimensional negative of Darlene Montgomery. The pageant queen was frozen forever in a horrifying, paralyzed scream, her facial features perfectly imprinted into the hardened resin. The shell was completely hollow, the organic flesh and bone long since liquefied and washed away by the caustic lye. But Thalassa was wrong. They hadn't vanished completely. Dr. Thorne knelt beside the hollow sculpture, clicking on a high-powered, medical-grade flashlight. He shined the brilliant beam directly through the semi-transparent neck of the fiberglass shell, illuminating the dark, hollow interior. Lye is a highly aggressive corrosive, Silas, Dr. Thorne whispered, adjusting his thick glasses, his voice shaking. It dissolves fat, muscle, and eventually bone, but it has limits. It cannot dissolve everything before the slurry is flushed out, especially not in organic matter or highly calcified biologicals. Thorne reached a pair of long, steel surgical forceps deep into the hollow throat cavity of the fiberglass shell. He scraped the interior wall where the thick resin had pooled in Darlene's mouth. When he pulled the forceps out, a collective shudder went through the crowd. Pinched between the steel prongs were 3 human molars, completely intact, with silver amalgam fillings. They were permanently embedded in a chunk of cured epoxy that the lye couldn't melt. Human teeth. Thorne said grimly, dropping them into a glass evidence jar with a sharp clink. Enamel is the hardest substance in the human body. The lye didn't have time to break it down. And there's more. The forensic team moved down the line, dismantling the perfect crime piece by horrific piece. Inside the second cocoon, the remains of Clara Sterling, they found thick strands of the heiress's hair permanently fused into the fiberglass matrix of the scalp. Inside the trunk of the rusted Buick, they didn't even need a flashlight. Arthur Pendleton's heavy resin cast had been rushed. Embedded directly into the thick, sloppy plastic casing around his wrist was his customized gold Rolex watch, forever stopped at the exact minute he suffocated. These were not just hollow plastic sculptures. They were crime scenes cast in stone. The killers had meticulously preserved the physical evidence of their own atrocities, baking the DNA, dental records, and personal effects of their victims into indestructible plastic molds. Ward stood up, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. He looked at the 4 hollow, screaming ghosts lined up on the grass, their white plastic skin gleaming in the afternoon sun. He had his bodies. He had his physical evidence. The defense of no corpse, no crime had just been shattered into a million pieces. Ward walked back toward the police cruisers where Thalassa Vane and Ines Calderon were locked in the back seat, completely surrounded by armed guards. He held up the heavy glass evidence jar, containing Darlene Montgomery's silver-filled teeth. He didn't say a word. He just let the brilliant Florida sun catch the silver, ensuring the killers saw exactly what he was holding. Thalassa's arrogant, beautiful mask finally, permanently, broke. Her face drained of color, her eyes widening in absolute, primal terror as she realized the swamp had betrayed them. The cocoon of lies had cracked wide open, and the only thing waiting for them now was the electric chair. The trial of Thalassa Vane and Ines Calderon began in February 1963, and it instantly became the darkest, most sensational media circus in Florida history. The sleepy town of Oakhaven was overrun by national reporters, true crime novelists, and flashing camera bulbs. The public was absolutely captivated by the grotesque juxtaposition of high society glamour and industrial slaughter. The press dubbed them the sculptors of Blackwater. Inside the suffocating wood-paneled courtroom, Detective Silas Ward sat stoically in the front row, his gray suit smelling faintly of stale tobacco. He watched as the prosecution rolled out the most chilling physical evidence the state had ever permitted before a jury. 4 hollow, milky white fiberglass casts were mounted on heavy steel stands in the center of the room. They looked like horrific, modern art ghosts. The jury visibly recoiled as Dr. Heiress took the stand, using a medical pointer to highlight the damning, irrefutable evidence permanently baked into the plastic. He pointed out the gold locket fused into Eleanor Vance's chest cavity, the silver-filled molars trapped in the resin of Darlene Montgomery's throat, and the heavy gold Rolex ticking silently in the crude, thick block of epoxy that was once Arthur Pendleton's wrist. Thalassa Vane, dressed in conservative, tailored navy dress, tried desperately to work her velvet magic on the jury. She wept. She played the victim. She claimed that Ines was a rogue, psychotic chemist who had formulated the lethal resin without her knowledge, turning a simple cosmetic procedure into a nightmare. Ines Calderon didn't weep. She sat at the defense table in a drab gray prison uniform, her dark hair pulled back into her signature tight, punishing bun. She never spoke a single word during the entire 3-week trial. She simply stared at the 4 hollow shells she created, her eyes cold, flat, and entirely unrepentant. It took the jury less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. When the judge read the sentence, guilty on 4 counts of capital murder in the first degree, Thalassa's legs finally gave out. She collapsed against the defense table, her flawless facade shattering into genuine, terrified hysteria. The judge banged his heavy wooden gavel, sentencing both women to die by electrocution. Ines didn't even blink. 2 years later, on a humid, thundering night in October 1965, the final procedure took place at Florida State Prison in Rayford. There was no gleaming silver Airstream. There was no soft, hypnotic jazz, and there was no crushed lavender. There was only the stark, blinding fluorescent light of the execution chamber and the heavy, ominous bulk of Old Sparky, the state's notoriously brutal oak electric chair. Thalassa went first. She had to be dragged into the chamber by 3 heavy-set guards, her eyes wide with primal, suffocating terror. She had spent her entire adult life worshiping the preservation of the human body, terrified of aging, terrified of decay. Now, she was forcefully strapped into the heavy leather restraints, a dark, poetic mirror to the cosmetological chair she had used to paralyze her victims. A heavy, salt-water-soaked sponge was placed on her shaved head. The executioner secured the thick leather mask over her face, permanently muffling her final, desperate screams. At exactly midnight, the warden nodded. The heavy switch was thrown. 2,000 volts of raw, unyielding electricity surged through Thalassa's body. It was a thermokinetic process far more violent than any chemical epoxy. Her body seized violently against the leather straps, her hands clenching into rigid, agonizing fists. Within seconds, the architect of the Chrysalis was dead, her flesh burned and ruined by the state's ultimate cure. Ines Calderon walked into the chamber 20 minutes later under her own power. She looked at the wooden chair, the heavy leather straps, and the lingering wisp of ozone in the air. She didn't fight. She sat down willingly, allowing the guards to secure her wrists and ankles. True to her nature, the silent chemist treated the electric chair like just another clinical mechanism. She closed her eyes before the mask was even lowered, accepting the lethal current with absolute, terrifying stillness. By 1 a.m., the sculptors of Blackwater were dead. Back in Oakhaven, the silver Airstream had long since been crushed for scrap metal. The citrus groves continued to bloom, and the wealthy widows at the country club found new, less lethal ways to chase their fading youth. But out in the dense, tangled heart of the Blackwater Slough, the dark water remained unchanged. The swamp kept its secrets, whispering through the heavy Spanish moss, a quiet reminder that true perfection is only ever found in death, and vanity is always the heaviest trap of all.